They're seemingly small things that can turn into a war. When my backyard and woodshop were flooded with sewage, I knew this was no accident, but the result of greed and abuse of power from HOAs who thought they could control everything. But this time they picked the wrong person to fight. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next exciting content. I never thought a normal morning could turn into my worst nightmare. When I opened the door to the backyard, I immediately backed away. A murky, foul-smelling puddle stretched across my once lush yard. My tomatoes, herbs, and rose bushes, which I had so painstakingly tended, were now submerged in a dark, bubbling liquid that seemed to have risen from hell. I held my breath as I stepped into the puddle, my shoes sinking into the slushy mud. Every step I took made a sickening gurgling sound. But the worst part wasn't the garden. My workshop, my pride, where I crafted exquisite pieces of furniture, was in ruins. The oak doors I'd completed just the week before were swollen with water, and the paint was peeling off in patches. Inside, the water was ankle-deep, and expensive wood panels floated like garbage. My machines, cutters, planers, drills, were streaked with rust. I bent down to pick up a piece of walnut, feeling the dampness seep into my skin. All the hard work and years it had taken to build this workshop had been destroyed overnight. I needed to know where this was coming from. I followed the water back up to the fence that separated my house from the HOA's common property, and there, buried in the trees, barely visible, was a brand new gray plastic pipe protruding from the ground. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. This wasn't an accident. Someone had installed this pipe, and they had directed it directly into my yard. Anger rising, I stormed into the house and called the HOA office. After a 15-minute wait, a dry voice answered. Margot Ellis, the HOA president, was known for her arrogance and disdain for residents who weren't up to par in her eyes. I tried to stay calm, explaining the sewage spilling into my yard and my woodshop. Margot let out a frustrated sigh. "Oh, we had a small change in the drainage last week. It could be a temporary side effect." "Side effect?" I gritted my teeth, insisting that my property was completely ruined. Margot chuckled. "Maybe you should check your drainage before you blame the HOA." Then the call ended. No promises, no commitment to inspect. I immediately called the county health department. They would send someone out, but not until the end of the week at the earliest. That meant at least 4 more days of living with the stench. 4 days of watching my backyard rot by the hour. When night fell, I couldn't sleep. The smell of sewage seeped into every corner, even with the windows closed. Rusty, my dog, whined in the corner, refusing to come out as if he knew the place had become toxic. I sat in the dark, looking at old photos of my woodworking shop and my lush garden. A year ago I had stood among them, feeling proud. Now all I had was this pile of rotting mud. And the HOA? Not only did they not take responsibility, they blamed me. I clenched my fists. This was no accident. This was a targeted attack. And if they thought I would just sit by and take it, they were sorely mistaken. I couldn't wait. The next morning as the sun rose, I put on my old boots, my work shirt, and set out to investigate on my own. If the HOA denied responsibility, I would find evidence to expose them. I followed the dirty water, wincing as the mud bubbled under my feet, each step leaving sticky tracks on my boots. The path led me to the HOA's commons, a small clearing between the buildings, with only a few rows of trees and a few old streetlights. But right in the thicket, where no one would notice, I saw it. The gray plastic pipe lying bare, the sewage still flowing in a steady stream. I knelt down and took pictures of every angle with my phone. The pipe couldn't have been there by accident. It was too new. The surface showed none of the wear and tear or rust that plagued the neighborhood's older systems. There was no sign of recent digging, meaning it had been installed discreetly, either with specialized machinery or at night to avoid being noticed. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the direction the water was flowing. It wasn't going into the city's main sewer system, but straight into my yard. I knew I needed more help. I called Dylan, a good friend from college who was now an environmental lawyer. When I sent him the photos, it took Dylan only a few seconds to realize the severity of the situation. He told me to leave the scene alone and not touch anything. Dylan showed up at my house 2 hours later, carrying a thick folder and a measuring tape. He carefully inspected the pipe, taking note of every detail, measuring the flow rate and especially its installation location. After a moment of inspection, Dylan stood up, his eyes flashing with an anger I had rarely seen. "They lied to you," he said, his voice full of conviction. "This wasn't an accident. They intentionally diverted the sewer system to dump sewage into your yard." He flipped open his folder, pointing to a diagram of the residential main. According to the original plan, all sewage from the HOA community center was supposed to be routed to the main sewer more than 3 blocks away. But with this new line, they had cut across the legal sewer system, diverting all the sewage onto my property. I felt my hands clench. "Why?" I asked, even though I had a bad feeling. Dylan shrugged, flipping to another page in the folder. "Money." He pointed to a number, $50,000. That estimated the cost to the HOA to bring the main sewer system up to code. By dumping their waste in your yard, they saved a huge amount of money. They didn't need to get a permit, didn't need to hire an official contractor, didn't have to pay any additional fees to the city. I gritted my teeth, trying to contain my rising anger. "So they think I'm just some nobody who can't do anything?" Dylan sighed. "They think you'll complain, you'll get angry, but you'll eventually give up. They think you don't have the money or the legal power to fight them." I looked out into the backyard where my woodworking shop was still flooded, where my garden was dead, where my life was being ruined by the greed and irresponsibility of the HOA. I tried to play by the rules. I called them, reported them to the authorities, waited for a solution. But all I got was ignorance and lies. I turned to Dylan. "I'm not a quitter. If they want to fight, I'll show them they picked the wrong guy." Dylan nodded, his eyes sharp. "Then we're not letting them get away with this." And from that moment on, I knew this was no longer a simple argument between a homeowner and an HOA. This was a war. And I wasn't going to stop until justice was served. I couldn't sit by and let the HOA bury the truth. If they thought I'd just take it easy like everyone else, they were wrong. I spent the afternoon printing out all the evidence, pictures of the new line, diagrams of the original sewer system, Dylan's report, even a cost breakdown showing how much the HOA had saved by dumping sewage directly into my yard. I didn't just want them to admit their mistake. I wanted them to have no way back. The HOA meeting was Thursday night at the community center. When I walked into the room, everyone was there. Margot Ellis, sitting in her plush leather chair in the middle of the long table. Howard, the HOA treasurer, who kept her head down, staring at the ledger as if the numbers were the only thing that mattered. And a scattering of residents sitting in rows of plastic chairs on either side. I felt wary glances, some avoiding eye contact, some whispering to each other. I didn't care. Margot looked at her watch and sighed. "Okay, since we've completed the other agenda items, we'll give Mr. Reynolds 3 minutes. She enunciated each word as if I were an unnecessary nuisance. "Please speak." I stood up, picked up my tablet, and plugged it straight into the projector. No beating around the bush, no pretense. I projected an image of the new pipe straight onto the screen. Murmurs filled the room. I zoomed in so everyone could see it clearly. Gray pipe, clean surface, sewage flowing steadily. "This," I said, speaking slowly and clearly, Is the pipe the HOA illegally installed to discharge sewage onto my property? I clicked to the next page, which showed the original sewer diagram. All the sewage from the community center was originally designed to flow into the main sewer system here. I pointed to the intersection 3 blocks away. But instead, the HOA rerouted the pipe, sending all the sewage straight into my yard. The atmosphere in the room changed. A few people leaned forward. A woman in the front row put her hand to her mouth, her face pale. Margot slowly crossed her arms, clicking her tongue. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice filled with false patience, "these pictures prove nothing. We didn't install that pipe. The HOA has no sewer projects this year." I clicked to the next page. Dylan's detailed report. This engineering drawing clearly shows the changes to the plumbing system. And this report, I held up the thick folder, was done by an environmental lawyer. I looked up at Margot. "So you're saying I dug this pipe myself? I dumped sewage into my own yard?" Margot shrugged, smiling faintly. "Maybe the old system had a leak, or maybe you're just making things up to get attention. We can't be held responsible for all your personal problems." Anger rose in me, but I kept my voice calm. "Do you remember the call I made to you, Margot?" She paused, but quickly regained her composure. "I get hundreds of calls a day. I can't remember every single one." I looked her straight in the eye. "Thankfully, I have a recording." The room fell dead silent. Margot froze for a few seconds. A man behind me coughed, while some of the residents whispered louder. I slowly pulled out my phone, set it on the table in front of me, and ran my fingers through the recordings. I didn't press play right away. I wanted to see her reaction. Margot paled for a brief moment, brief enough that the unwary might miss it, but not me. But she quickly recovered, folded her arms, and smiled faintly. "Recording without consent is illegal in this state, Mr. Reynolds. I don't think you want to get yourself into legal trouble, do you?" I pursed my lips. "So you admit you said something worth recording?" She paused again, then sighed, turning to Howard. "We don't need to waste any more time on this." Then she looked straight at me, her eyes cold as steel. "If you have a problem with the HOA, file your complaint in writing. This meeting is over." She stood, took the papers from in front of her, and left, not giving me a chance to say anything more. But I didn't need to. I looked around the room, noticing that the other residents' eyes had changed. Some still avoided looking directly at me, but a few, who had been silent before, were now looking at me with sympathy. An older man nodded slightly as I passed. Margot could stop the meeting, but she couldn't stop the truth. And I knew, with every shred of evidence I had, that her game wouldn't last much longer. The next morning, when I stepped out onto the porch, a thick white envelope was sitting on the doorstep. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a foreboding presence as soon as I saw the Fairview Pines Homeowners Association seal in the left corner. I tore open the envelope, my eyes quickly scanning the contents. Notice of violation. The letter was cold and mechanical, as if it had been written on a template. The HOA had charged me with violating the property maintenance ordinance, citing my filthy backyard as a detriment to the neighborhood. They were imposing a $200 fine per day until the problem was corrected. The letter was signed by Howard Whitman, the HOA treasurer, but it didn't take much guessing to know who was behind it. Margot. I clenched the letter, anger rising in my chest. They had turned my property into a toxic waste dump, then blamed me. They figured if they flooded me with fines, I would give up. But if that was their plan, they had underestimated me. I took out my phone, took a picture of the letter, and then walked out into the backyard. The scene had not changed. The sewage had dried, leaving a thick layer of black sludge clinging to every inch of the ground. The once lush vegetable beds that had once been my pride were now dead, twisted trees. Every time I walked into the woodshop, I had to cover my nose to avoid the musty smell that wafted up from the rotting boards. Termites and mold had begun to invade the remaining tools, corroding every metal surface. They wanted me to clean up? They wanted me to clean up the mess they had made? My anger flared, but I forced myself to calm down. I knew the HOA was trying to provoke me, to force me to react emotionally. If I wanted to fight them, I needed to do it my way. I walked into the house, turned on my computer, and started searching. I logged into the county's land information system, looking for documents related to my property and the surrounding properties. It took me almost an hour to dig through dozens of meaningless files, but then I found it. The Fairview expansion. A residential expansion plan submitted by a private company called Ellis Property Group, a familiar name, Margot Ellis. The filings showed that her company was looking to buy up several neighboring lots to expand the community center and build a new commercial district. But there was a problem. My lot was right in the middle of the zoning district. I squinted at the plan. They wanted my land, and if I didn't sell, they would create enough trouble to force me out. Suddenly, the pieces in my head began to fit together. They had deliberately dumped sewage into my yard not just to save money, but to turn my property into a dumping ground. They wanted me isolated, desperate, wanting me to the point where I had no choice but to sell my house cheap and leave. Had they done this before? I scanned the records, my eyes landing on one name, Daniel Hoover, a resident who had sold his house 2 years ago right next to the community center. When I dug deeper, I discovered that he had filed a drainage complaint before moving out. My anger was no longer just anger. This was more than a simple abuse of power. This was a plan, a deliberate ploy. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. If Margot thought I would back down, she had misjudged me. They wanted to force me out? I will show them what a real war is like. I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the HOA to strike again. They'd use tricks to force me out, so I might as well teach them a lesson in a way they wouldn't forget. But I didn't want to be prosecuted for vandalism. If I did something, it had to be smart, calculated. I called my cousin Zach, a construction professional who I knew wouldn't ask too many questions. When I explained the situation, Zach paused for a moment, then asked a single question: "Do you want it temporary or permanent?" I knew what he meant. If I poured concrete into the HOA office, that would be a real act of vandalism. But if I could do something disruptive, something that would make them miserable without permanent damage, that would be the perfect counterattack. And so Zach mentioned industrial foam. It's used in construction to fill large voids. When exposed to air, it expands and hardens, looking like concrete but actually dissolving with a special enzyme solution. It's strong enough to clog things, tough enough that no one will be able to clean it up overnight, but it won't cause permanent damage. It's perfect for what I have in mind. We start making plans. The HOA office will be closed for the weekend for renovations. A project I suspect is a way to legitimize the embezzled money. That means no one will be in there until Monday. The perfect space for me to do it. Zach brought 4 buckets of industrial foam and a small pump he used on construction sites. We changed the license plate on Zach's truck, covering his company logo with a magnetic sticker that said City Maintenance Services, in case anyone saw it. We spent the day checking the building's security system. The HOA had 2 cameras, one at the main entrance and one in the corner of the parking lot, but I noticed that both were dummies. I stood on the sidewalk surveying the HOA office under the dim street lights. There were no cars parked in front of the door and everything was quiet. I took a deep breath, then nodded to Zach. Now for action. I unlocked the back door using a technique I'd learned from a series of YouTube videos. It took less than a minute. When the door opened, we moved swiftly, dragging the heavy pump inside. Zach started the engine. As the foam began to pour, I adjusted the pump, directing the stream into Margot's filing cabinet, where she kept stacks of paperwork about the ridiculous fines she'd sent to residents. I let the foam cover every drawer, every file. Her fine leather chair, the one only she was allowed to sit in, was slowly sinking into the gray-white foam. I walked to the reception area where Howard usually sat and extended the line all the way to his desk. Computer screens, phones, drawers, everything was engulfed in the hardening foam. Within 15 minutes, the HOA office had become a sculpture from hell. Zach checked his watch. 3 minutes until it's completely frozen. I stepped back, admiring the results. The foam had filled the space, turning the HOA office into a solid, unusable mass. But more importantly, they couldn't just smash it up and clean it up. They'd have to call in a professional, get permission, spend days or weeks trying to figure out how to remove it. Before I left, I walked over to Margot's desk. In the hardening foam, I pressed a handprint into the surface. My handprint. A reminder that I would not be trampled. When we left, everything was quiet. No one saw, no one knew. But when Margot opened the door to her office on Monday morning, they would know they had picked the wrong person to mess with. Monday morning came sooner than I expected. I woke up early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat on the porch, waiting for the moment I knew would come. At 8:17 a.m., a shiny SUV pulled up in front of the HOA office. Margot Ellis stepped out, phone in hand, her blonde hair neatly curled as always. I could picture her cold gaze scanning the empty parking lot before she reached the door. Little did she know that in a few seconds, everything she had control over would be turned upside down. I took a sip of coffee, watching calmly as Margot inserted her key into the lock. She opened the door, stepped inside, and immediately backed away, her hands gripping the doorframe. I couldn't hear the scream, but I could feel it. I smiled. Margot stood there for a few seconds, seemingly trying to comprehend what had just happened. Then she jerked the phone to her ear, frantically calling someone. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd had gathered outside the HOA office. Howard, the HOA treasurer, Meg, Margot's personal assistant, and a few other staff members. They were all frozen, eyes wide, mouths agape as they stared at what was inside. I'd been there the night before. I knew what they were seeing. The entire HOA office had been buried in a solid mass of gray-white foam. There were no desks, no computers, no filing cabinets. Everything was frozen, submerged, turned into a monstrous sculpture. The angular lines of Margot's fine leather chair were still recognizable. But it was no longer a chair. It was part of the lifeless foam. The drawers filled with HOA fines were now just round lumps of foam poking up from the floor. Even the gold logo engraved on the reception desk was buried. Margot lunged inside, trying to touch the foam, but she immediately withdrew her hand as if she had touched hot metal. The foam was rock hard, unbreakable, unscratched. It couldn't be removed by hand. Howard came in behind her, trying to push a filing cabinet, but it wouldn't budge. He tried kicking a corner of Margot's desk with his foot, but only left a useless boot print in the hard foam. Then they started to panic. Margot's phone kept ringing. The HOA staff was at a loss for what to do. One tried turning on the air conditioning, as if the cold air would melt the foam. Another ran to his car, brought back a garden shovel, and scratched helplessly. Nothing changed. I rested my chin on my hand, watching the scene like it was a dark comedy. They had once ordered me to clean up the sewage they had deliberately dumped in my yard. Now they were faced with a mess they couldn't clean up. After a while, Margot pulled out her phone and called someone. Within 20 minutes, 2 police officers showed up. One of them was Officer Radley, the man I'd seen drinking coffee at the local coffee shop. Margot ordered them to investigate, but even they didn't know where to start. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no broken locks, no witnesses. Meg, Margot's assistant, standing trembling near the door, suddenly blurted out, "It could be Mr. Reynolds. He threatened to sue the HOA last week." Margot seized on the idea, turning to the police, eyes blazing with rage. "He must be. He has a motive." But Radley wasn't buying it. "Do you have proof?" Margot froze. Howard interjected. "We have security cameras." I smiled. "They definitely do. But they don't work." An employee ran to check the cameras. He returned a few minutes later, his face ashen. "The system was turned off 3 months ago," Margot yelled in frustration. "No proof, no suspects." I looked at my watch. It was almost 9:30 a.m., and residents were already gathering outside to see what was going on. My neighbors, people who had been bullied by the HOA for years, watched with amusement. They didn't need to know who did it. They just knew it happened. And me? I just picked up my coffee and sipped slowly, enjoying the chaos I'd created. I didn't have to wait long for things to start to fall apart. Margot Ellis could evade responsibility for the sewage. She could slap me with ridiculous fines, but she couldn't get away with it forever. 2 days after the chaos at the HOA office, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before picking up, but as soon as the person on the other end spoke, I knew this was no ordinary call. "Mr. Reynolds," the voice was low and calm. "My name is Ray Harrison. I'm a detective with the district attorney's office. We need to talk." I stood still, my heart pounding. A detective? I thought briefly of the HOA office incident, but quickly dismissed the thought. If they had enough evidence against me, they wouldn't have called me, they would have knocked on my door. "We've been investigating Margot Ellis for the past 6 months, Harrison continued, "and I thought you might like to know that she's in serious trouble." I took a deep breath, gripping the phone tighter. Harrison didn't beat around the bush. He got straight to the point. Margot wasn't just a petty abuser. She was a systematic embezzler. I sat back in my chair and listened as Harrison described what they had discovered. Over the past 4 years, Margot and Howard Whitman, the HOA's treasurer, had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from community maintenance funds, road repair funds, embezzled, park improvement funds, money gone, new sewer lines never actually implemented. Instead, the money had been funneled through a series of personal accounts, hidden behind fake invoices. They had used it to pay for lavish vacations, upgrade the interior of their homes, and, as I suspected, pour it into the Fairview expansion development that Margot was trying to get off the ground. I couldn't believe it. I'd always known the HOA was corrupt, but I hadn't imagined the depth of it. I heard papers flipping on the other end of the line before Harrison continued, "We've been monitoring their accounts for a long time, but we needed a good reason to intervene, and thanks to the recent incident at the HOA office, we got it." I smirked. I didn't know how many people were secretly happy to see the mess, but to me, it was the trigger for something bigger. Harrison lowered his voice. "We'll be executing the warrant tomorrow morning. I thought you might want to see it." I didn't need reminding. The next morning at 8:45, I stood on the porch where I could see the HOA office in the distance. A line of police cars pulled up, silent but imposing. 3 patrol cars, 1 unmarked. When the car doors opened, Margot and Howard emerged from the office, immediately stopped. Margot looked as if she still didn't understand what was happening. She said something angrily to the nearest officer, but as soon as she saw the handcuffs glinting in the sunlight, she paled. Howard? He didn't say anything. He just stood there, frozen, as if his brain had stopped working. Margot Ellis and Howard Whitman were arrested right there on the steps of the HOA office. I could hear the neighbors whispering. They stood there, watching. No one stepping forward to defend Margot. No one believed her facade anymore. When they searched the office, the police pulled out dozens of forged documents, altered invoices, and evidence of illegal banking transactions. All of it pointed to Margot and Howard. They had no way to deny it. I picked up my coffee slowly, sipped it, savoring the sweetness of the moment. I hadn't had to be directly involved in this. They'd set themselves up for it. Margot looked around as if searching for someone to blame. Then her eyes fell on me. She understood. I just smiled, nodding slightly, a farewell to the person who'd thought he could push me out of my own home. Margot was shoved into the police car, Howard handcuffed right after. The car doors slammed shut. They'd lost. My victory hadn't come overnight, but it had come surely. 3 days after Margot and Howard were arrested, an emergency meeting of the Fairview Pines community was held. This time there were no tyrannical executives, no blatant manipulation, no sarcastic authoritative tone from Margot. She was out. I walked into the hall, and for the first time I noticed a completely different atmosphere. No more pressure. No more wary looks from neighbors whenever someone talked about the HOA. Today they were here to take back control. A new slate of candidates was drawn up in just 30 minutes. Jennifer, who had been denied wheelchair access 3 times by the HOA, was elected president. Michael, who had been fined thousands of dollars for installing solar panels, became treasurer. Faces I had seen silent before stood up, strong and clear. The HOA that Margot had controlled was officially gone. And me? I wasn't in. I had enough trouble with HOAs for one lifetime. But when Jennifer asked if I wanted to help establish a community garden, I said yes. If I could help build something instead of destroy it, it would be the perfect ending. Cleaning up my backyard took 3 weeks. The county issued a mandatory order that the HOA be responsible for restoring my entire property, including the woodshop. A team of environmental experts came out, dug up the contaminated soil, and replaced it with new, nutrient-rich soil. When they were done, my yard was not only back to normal, it was better than before. My wood shop was completely restored with new equipment, replacing what had been destroyed. One morning, I walked into the shop and smelled the fresh wood, familiar yet new. I put my hand on the newly replaced workbench, feeling its smooth surface. I had reclaimed everything the HOA had tried to take away. But what made me laugh the most was Margot's punishment. After pleading guilty to a reduced sentence, Margot was sentenced to 18 months of community service. Her first assignment? Cleaning up the Fairview Pines neighborhood. I can't tell you how happy I was to see her, in her bright orange reflective vest, shoveling trash from the side of the road, a place she'd once issued a fine to neighbors for overgrown grass. Howard disappeared from town shortly after he was bailed out. I guess he had no place to stay. And the HOA? It cost nearly $1 million to clean up the hardened foam I'd left behind. They had to hire a team of chemical experts to clean it up, and it took more than 2 months. The insurance company refused to pay because the incident didn't fall under ordinary damages. I heard they had to use the HOA's reserve fund to pay the entire cleaning bill. It was money Margot had been embezzling, money she'd been splurging on luxuries. Now it was being used to clean up the mess I'd made. It was a perfect circle. 6 months later, my life was back to normal. Even better. My garden was flourishing, my woodworking shop was running like nothing had ever happened. Rusty, my dog, was finally coming out into the yard without seeming panic. No more sewage smells, no more threats from the HOA, no more unreasonable fine letters. One afternoon, I found an envelope in the mailbox. There was no return address. I opened it, and inside was a piece of hard foam, part of the sculpture that once covered the HOA office, now a relic of Fairview Pines history. Next to it was a note that simply read, "Sometimes justice requires a little creativity." I laughed, placing the piece of foam on my workshop workbench like a souvenir trophy. They tried to bury me, but in the end, they were the ones who were buried.